History of the Mensekinder Ophalad. The Mensekinder Ophalad could trace its roots all the way back to the N7.000s. That year was the year the first kings rose again, for their home world of Mens Prime was not a fresh one. Far from it, in fact. The Mensekinder species were also part of the ancient Neomesnate. There were Mensekinder all over the galaxy, but their home world was a hotspot. After the long night of the universe, however, the civilization on their home world had collapsed into barbarism. Thousands of tribes fought over the scraps of their ravaged planet. Most of its seas, being drained long ago, left little water on the world. Wars over the scant resources were common, and they spanned many decades. The world was quickly falling apart. However, one day a man would rise from this savagery and ignorance, a man named Leopold Durante. He had discovered an ancient seed vault in the abandoned ruins of the planet's sub-cities, now buried under kilometers of sand and ash. With these seeds he took several followers on a pilgrimage called the Trek to Salvation. Lasting a year, they eventually ended up at the River Carlton, establishing the Kingdom of Carlton in N7.983. King Leopold commands his disciples to cultivate the desert and the dirt around the river. It took decades, but by the turn of the millennium the desert was showing signs of what could become a blossoming kingdom. However, in this time of cultivating there was a strange occurrence. Out on the edge of the kingdom, a lonesome village experienced an encounter with a UFO. It hovered over the village for multiple minutes, before then drowning it in a pale green light and flying away. A messenger was sent to the king, trying to alert him to what had happened. But the messenger never arrived, captured by highway bandits, and killed. The king never got to know about the UFO before he died. But the tale lived on in the folk tales of the villagers. Over the next 200 years the kingdom of Carlton would migrate down the river Carlton to the border of what was known as the Isle of Leopold. They built a towering castle on the edge of the river. It was called Ode to the Great Leopold, and stood at an amazing 100 meters tall. The next 150 years was known as the colony period, and it was a time of great expansion, mostly across the surrounding rivers and the isle. At the end of the N8.35 a king named Fosse Durante came to power. He was the sixth in the Durante dynasty. But he had greater ambitions than to just be king. He had dreams of empire, of further expansion. But his dreams were only possible due to an ancient object he found whilst on a pilgrimage through the desert. The wreckage of an SKT. It had a pattern for the construction of steam engines, machines of war, nuclear weapons, and flight. With this SKT pattern he brought industry back to the boundless sands of Mens Prime. He created the Empire of Carlton and exiled the old order of Leopold, casting them out of their centuries-old home. They were forced to trek for 60 days and 60 nights to the Lake Matraz, where they set up a camp, quickly growing into Leopold's order in exile. Meanwhile the Empire of Carlton expanded, occupying and annexing the majority of the Isle of Leopold from rival tribes, gangs, and kingdoms. But it wouldn't be long until the exiled would strike back. The exiled sent envoys and diplomats in every direction, spreading out from their base of operations. Many nations, gangs, clans, and kingdoms pledged allegiance to the exiled's cause, hoping to reap the rewards of the, what they called, God Whisperer. And it was on the 26th of Leo, N8.352, that the first invasion would be launched. Millions of men and women stormed the relatively lightly defended towers and castles of the outer empire. Quickly Carlton's defenses were overrun, and their outer border fell to looting, pillaging, and burning. The war lasted a full 1 year and had casualties in the millions. But in the end, the power of the empire was too great, and Leopold's order in exile was formally disbanded on 8th of Virgo, N8.353. After the empire won the War of Leopold's Last as it came to be known, their expansion efforts continued. Fosse Durante would be succeeded by his son and subsequently his son's daughter, but the empire continued to expand anyway. Going up and downstream alike, setting up cities along the way. This period of colonization lasted 250 years, but it was not entirely peaceful. Hundreds of different gangs, tribes, and cultures were displaced, having to move into the more inhospitable wastes of the world. These clans built up over time, forming dense cities of outlaws and criminals, of which many had banded together to form the Alliance of the Wastes, a partial successor to the Matraz Alliance. These bands of pirates, scavengers, crooks, and criminals begun to assault the empire. It was a constant tide of the shores of the Kaldon, their waves endlessly breaking against the proverbial sea walls of the empire. After 5 decades of constant onslaught, however, something had to give, and that something was the empire. On the 31st of Allura, N 8.655, the Empire Kaldon dissolved into hundreds of different successor states, all with nuclear weapons. For the latter half of the N 8.600s, dozens of nuclear wars were waged across the surface of the world, making the already uninhabitable desert completely irradiated. It seemed that civilization on the world of Mens Prime was doomed by nuclear fire to the void of death. The last remnants of the Mensekinder people who weren't totally irradiated/mutated were forced to flee underground. They constructed massive labyrinthine tunnels and bunkers underground that could support their minuscule population. It was in N 8.679 that the doors to the Vault of Arabunda were sealed shut, not to reopen for centuries. In the meantime, 2 major things would occur: the founding of the children of the Ep2, and the arrival of new Technon. The children of the Ep2 were the precursors to the modern-day grandchildren of the Ep2. They were the Mensekinder that were either didn't have a choice or were forced to stay on the surface. Slowly, over the years, their bodies would begin to succumb to radiation sickness/poisoning. And slowly over time they had to replace more and more of their bodies with technology and machines. Quite quickly they grew to revere technology as the savior of their bodies and minds. Over 100 years they managed to recover more and more technology from the fallen age of the Neomesniat. Eventually they were able to construct a ship called the Rung Adun Spring. The majority of Mens Prime's surface population boarded the ship and set a course to a new, much less hostile world, leaving Mens Prime behind. After a year-long journey, they renewed civilization on the outermost planet in the Mens system, Orville. The large world was one of frozen, large, barren plains and enormous ice spikes that could rival the tallest mountains that Mens Prime had to offer. Here they created the Chichan of Savior Tech, a massive, intricately constructed temple that doubled as an advanced bore. It dug deep into the world and harvested its resources for use in industrializing the world. But sometime in the N 8.740s, a discovery was made: Orville was an egg. The Yulim galaxy is filled with many strange things, and this is a wonderful example. The Junne Tempest are a gigantic species. They are about 1,000 kilometers in diameter and resemble a mix of a sugar glider and a starfish. Interestingly, it seems there are 2 species, the Junne Tempest Sidereum and the Junne Tempest Cosmicon. The key difference between the 2 is that one seems to feed on the cosmic background radiation of the universe, as wherever they go the background radiation levels are unnaturally low. These variants' fur is usually brown. And the other feeds of starlight, their hair actually being photosynthetic receptors. These variants change color depending on which type of star they are around because each star favors a slightly different wavelength of light. Junne Tempest mating strategy is for males to release elegant displays of light in the solar system they're in, sometimes outshining the very star itself. If they manage to attract a mate and impregnate them, the female will lay the foetus inside of the largest available solid body in the system, the object's crust becoming the shell for the egg. The object's size will directly correlate to the final size of the offspring. Orville was one of these eggs, and when the Chichan of Savior Tech discovered it, the children of the Ep2 had a choice to make. Either they allowed it to hatch, and again have to set up station on another world, or they could kill it and save Orville. Unfortunately for the Junne Tempest foetus, they chose the latter. It was euthanized and left to rot in the core of the world, untouched for centuries. That was until the creation of St. Tempest Sorrow in N9.050, but we'll get back to that later. The children of the Ep2, despite their rough beginning, had managed to survive what they came to know as the Mensekinder, which translates to Men's Diaspora in Nova Bionary, the language of the children/grandchildren of the Ep2. The other major event was the arrival of the Terra Corps of New Technon. The Terra Corps was a force of about 100,000 ships which was divided into 5 fleets, each having roughly 20,000 ships each. Their mission is to terraform worlds to the needs of different species. Once they were terraformed, they would be colonized and formally join New Technon. Mens Prime was one of these planets. Fleet Osiris deposited a Terra Corps ship into the system before leaving. When the ship arrived in orbit of Mens Prime, it immediately began its work. The surface of the world was paved over with durafiber so that it was completely flat. It was then built over to accommodate the Kadeshi species. The Kadeshi are an amphibian species that looks like a mix of a toad and Christmas beetle. So the Mensekinder's birth worlden was turned into a deep and thick swamp/mangrove. The terraforming was finished in N8.878, and the world was fully populated and integrated into New Technon by N8.888. However, the nation that the newest inhabitants of the world had joined was living on borrowed time. For it was only 112 years after world of Mens Prime joined New Technon that it would collapse. With the collapse of New Technon in N9.000, Mens Prime, the Mens system, and 1,000 others reformed into the Parliament of Long. This nation was a collection of roughly 2,500 worlds which were connected by nearest Nalum gates. The Parliament itself was on the world of Niruknox, 100 light-years away from Mens Prime and a 3-day flight through a nearest Nalum gate. It was a hybrid of representative and direct democracy. The retrocortex noosphere of the general public, think of it as a mix of the modern-day internet, virtual reality, and other media. Through this retrocortex noosphere the public are able to vote independently from representatives on small/minor laws. But when major laws are being passed, the representatives work together with the public to represent them as best as possible by connecting directly to the noosphere. There is one representative per million sentients, therefore there is 16 billion representatives. With this vast number of representatives, they too have their own, smaller retrocortex noosphere, where groups of 1 million representatives are themselves governed over by parliamentarians, making 16,000 parliamentarians in the Senate itself. However, a unified Parliament of Long was not to last for long. After only 220 years there was a civil war. On Mens Prime it was decided that it was all out easier to just destroy their greater connections to the Parliament of Long than try and fight in the civil war. So on the 17th of Sagittarius, N9.226, all the nearest Nalum gates in the Mens system were closed forever. Once again, Mens Prime was galactically isolated. Hoped you liked the video. Don't forget to dislike and unsubscribe from my channel. Part 2 coming soon.